A German soldier lying in the frozen mud outside Holtzwihr would later describe what he saw as impossible. The American tank destroyer in front of him was burning, flames licking through a hole torn in its armor, black smoke rolling low across the snow. No one could still be alive up there. And yet the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on its turret kept firing, and kept firing, and kept firing. We saw the vehicle burning and assumed no one could still be inside it, one German infantryman would later recall. Then the gun fired again. It was the afternoon of January 26, 1945. 6 German tanks and roughly 250 infantrymen were advancing across open snowfields toward a single American company dug into a tree line outside a small French village that almost no one back home had ever heard of. The company had been ordered to hold that ground at any cost. It had fewer than 20 effective men left to do it with. One of them chose to stay behind, alone, in the open, while his company fell back to safety. He was 19 years old. To understand why a teenage lieutenant would climb onto a burning wreck and take on 6 tanks with a machine gun meant for the back of a truck, you first have to understand where he was standing and why that particular stretch of French farmland, on that particular winter afternoon, was worth dying for. By January of 1945, most of France had already been free for months. Paris had celebrated its liberation the previous August. The maps in American newspapers showed a country nearly cleared, a war rolling east toward Germany itself. But maps lie by omission. Tucked into the southeastern corner of the country, along the west bank of the Rhine, one stubborn wound remained open. The Germans called it a bridgehead. History would call it the Kulmar pocket, and it was the last significant piece of French soil the Wehrmacht still held. It should not have still been there. By every rule of the collapsing Western Front, the pocket should have folded weeks earlier. Instead, German commanders had reinforced it, understanding exactly what it represented: a foothold back onto French ground, a threat to the flank of the advancing Allied line, and proof, however thin, that the war in the West was not yet decided. For the French population trapped inside it, the pocket meant something else entirely. It meant that liberation, the word painted on banners across the rest of the country, had simply never arrived. Villages like Holtzwihr had spent an extra winter under occupation while their neighbors down the road already lived free. The weather did not care about any of this. Alsace in January 1945 delivered one of the coldest winters in memory, snow drifting waist-deep in places, temperatures dropping far below freezing at night. Rifles jammed. Boots froze solid. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite before they ever fired a shot in anger. A German report on the fighting west of the Rhine that winter described the cold itself as an enemy that spared no uniform. Into this landscape, flat farm country broken by patches of dense forest and canals frozen at the edges, the 3rd Infantry Division of the United States Army pushed forward, tasked with closing the pocket for good. The 3rd Infantry Division carried a nickname earned in an earlier war, the Rock of the Marne. By January 1945, its men had already fought through North Africa, Sicily, mainland Italy, and the invasion of southern France the previous August. They had climbed through the Vosges Mountains in autumn rain and now faced one final winter push before the war's end was even conceivable. One German assessment of the American units advancing through Alsace that winter captured a change the occupiers had noticed and did not care for. The Americans did not fight like men expecting to go home soon, one German report noted. They fought like men who had already decided to finish what they started. The push to finally close the pocket was never an American effort alone. The French First Army, commanded by General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, drove up from the south and west, while American divisions attacked from the north, a coordinated pincer designed to trap the German garrison before it could withdraw across the Rhine. French troops, many of them colonial soldiers, who had already fought their way up from North Africa and Italy, bled for that same frozen farmland alongside the Americans converging on Holtzwihr. The story of Kulmar has room for more than one nation's courage. It simply happens that on one particular afternoon, at one particular tree line, the fate of an entire company came down to a single American officer's decision not to run. Among the officers leading that push was a second lieutenant barely old enough to be described as a man at all. His name was Audie Murphy, and almost nothing about his early life suggested a future soldier, let alone the most decorated American of the entire war. He had grown up dirt poor in Hunt County, Texas, the 7th of 12 children, in a sharecropping family that never had enough of anything. His father walked out when Audie was still a boy. His mother died when he was 16. He left school early to pick cotton and hunt small game to help feed his younger siblings, learning to shoot not for sport, but because a missed shot meant a hungry table. When he tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor, recruiters took one look at his slight frame and turned him away. He kept trying. Eventually, the army took him. What followed was not a slow rise through the ranks, it was closer to a collision. Murphy fought through Sicily, through the brutal stalemate at Anzio, through the invasion of southern France, and into the freezing forests of the Vosges, where he was wounded more than once and decorated for actions that already sounded, on paper, like fiction. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross for holding a position alone after his squad had been cut down around him. He earned 2 Silver Stars. He was battlefield commissioned from the enlisted ranks to second lieutenant, an honor reserved for soldiers whose men would follow them anywhere, and by January 1945 that was exactly what his men did. He did not look the part. Slight, quiet, boyish, he unsettled new arrivals who expected their commander to look like a war poster. The men who had served under him longer knew better than to judge him by his size. A captured German intelligence summary from that winter, assessing the quality of American replacements reaching the front, offered an unintentional tribute to soldiers exactly like him. Their replacements were younger than before, one German assessment read, but they no longer hesitated the way earlier troops sometimes did. On January 24, 1945, the Third Division crossed the Ill River and pushed toward Holtzwihr. Company B, Murphy's company, took up position at the edge of a stretch of woodland known as the Bois de Riedvier, a wedge of forest whose 2 arms of trees stretched out toward the village like oaken fingers. 2 American tank destroyers sat astride the single dirt road running through that wedge, the only route German armor could realistically use to advance. Murphy understood immediately that if the enemy came, they would come straight up that road. Among the men who would spend that afternoon watching from the tree line was a private named Anthony Abramski, who had served alongside Murphy long enough to know exactly what his lieutenant was and was not capable of. What Abramski witnessed that day would stay with him for the rest of his life, described decades later as the single most stunning act of raw nerve he ever saw another human being perform. The morning of January 26th had been quiet, the kind of quiet that soldiers who have survived enough winters learn not to trust. Breath hung visible in the cold air. Men checked frozen rifle actions for the 3rd or 4th time, stamped feeling back into boots, said little. Word had already reached the company that reinforcements were behind schedule. They would fight the day with what they had. They came at 2 in the afternoon on January 26th, preceded by an artillery barrage that churned the snow into black craters. 6 tanks rolled out of Holtzwihr, with infantry moving behind and beside them in loose formation, using the open, snow-covered fields for what little concealment they offered. Company B had already been bled thin by weeks of fighting through the pocket. Reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion, 30th Infantry, that were supposed to arrive before the attack had not yet reached the position. Murphy had telephoned battalion headquarters that morning asking for updated orders. The answer had been simple: hold your position. Now he watched roughly 250 German infantrymen and 6 tanks converge on a company that could field barely 20 rifles. A German company commander involved in planning the assault would later describe the arithmetic exactly as it appeared from his side of the field. 6 tanks against 1 company, that officer recalled. We expected the position to collapse within the hour. Murphy did the only sane thing available to him. He ordered his men to fall back to prepared defensive positions deeper in the woods, out of the direct line of the advancing armor, where a stand might actually be survivable. Then, instead of falling back with them, he stayed at his forward command post, alone, with a field telephone in his hand, and began calling artillery coordinates back to the guns supporting his sector. Every American soldier he commanded moved to safety. Their lieutenant did not. What happened over the following hour would be reconstructed later from multiple accounts, American and German, and even stripped of embellishment. It reads like something no one should have survived. As the German advance intensified, one of the 2 tank destroyers near Murphy's position took a direct hit. Fuel and ammunition inside it caught fire almost immediately, and thick black smoke began pouring from its hull. Its crew, wounded and unable to fight the vehicle any longer, abandoned it and withdrew toward the tree line, leaving the burning wreck sitting in the open between Murphy's position and the advancing German force. Any reasonable soldier would have used that moment to retreat with them. Murphy climbed on top of it instead. The tank destroyer's 50 caliber machine gun sat exposed on its turret ring, fully visible from 3 directions, sitting atop a vehicle that could explode at any moment as the fire inside it spread toward its remaining ammunition stores. Murphy climbed up anyway, took hold of the gun, and opened fire on the advancing German infantry. He kept the field telephone with him, continuing to call artillery corrections with one hand while firing the machine gun with the other, directing high-explosive rounds onto formations barely a few hundred meters from his own position, even as he engaged targets directly in front of him with the 50 caliber. When an artillery officer asked how close the enemy actually was, witnesses later said Murphy simply told him to listen for himself over the open line. For the better part of an hour, that single machine gun position dictated the shape of the battle. German infantry advancing across open snow found themselves cut down by fire they could not locate, its source obscured by the same smoke pouring off the burning wreck that should have killed the man firing it. Every time we tried to move the infantry forward, the gun found us, one German infantryman recalled after the war. We could not see who was firing it or from where. Murphy was wounded in the leg at some point during the engagement, the exact moment lost to the chaos, and kept firing regardless, blood freezing against fabric already stiff with cold. At one point, a German squad used the smoke as cover to crawl unnoticed toward his right flank, working their way into a drainage ditch barely meters from the burning vehicle, close enough that ordinary rifle fire would have been useless against him. Murphy spotted them before they could close the distance, traversed the machine gun, and ended the threat in a single sustained burst. Germans reached as close as 10 yards to his position that afternoon. None of them reached closer. 2 accounts from the German side of that hour described the same tactical unraveling from different angles, and together they explained something the raw casualty figures cannot. The tanks would not advance without their infantry, one German officer's post-war account observed. No commander sends armor forward alone into a tree line full of American guns. That single sentence contains the real mechanism behind Murphy's stand, and it deserves unpacking because the heroics alone do not fully explain how one machine gun stopped 6 tanks. German armored doctrine by 1945, hammered into shape across years of hard lessons on the Eastern Front, depended on close cooperation between tanks and supporting infantry. Armor advancing without infantry escort was dangerously exposed to close assault, to anti-tank teams working from cover, to exactly the kind of ambush a wood line full of dug-in Americans could deliver. Tank commanders knew this. It was doctrine, drilled and non-negotiable. Murphy's machine gun did not need to destroy those 6 tanks to defeat them. It only needed to destroy the infantry protecting them. Every squad his fire cut down in the open snow was one fewer set of eyes and one fewer rifle standing between a German tank and an American bazooka team waiting somewhere in the tree line. As the infantry attack wavered under sustained fire, it could not locate, and as artillery Murphy continued to direct by phone tore into the follow-on waves, the tanks found themselves increasingly alone in open ground, their protective screen shredded. Rather than press an isolated armored advance into unknown defenses, the tank commanders did exactly what their training told them to do. They pulled back. It was, in effect, a single junior officer conducting 2 separate jobs that normally required 2 separate men entirely, forward artillery observer and infantry gunner, simultaneously, under direct fire, while wounded for the better part of an hour. A German assessment written after the action struggled to reconcile the scale of the resistance with what German intelligence believed remained of the defending company. Our estimates placed no more than a handful of effective defenders in that position, one German report concluded. The resistance we encountered did not match those estimates. It could not have. The estimates were built on the assumption of a company. What they actually faced, at the center of it, was one man who had refused to leave. When his ammunition finally ran out, Murphy climbed down from the wreck. His leg wound had gone untreated for the better part of an hour, and had likely worsened with every movement since. He made his way back on foot across open smoking ground that had just been a battlefield, back toward the tree line where the remainder of his company waited. When he reached them, medics wanted to evacuate him immediately. He refused. There was still a company to command, and a position that needed holding, and Audie Murphy was not finished for the day. He reorganized what remained of Company B, gathered stragglers and whatever support elements he could pull together, and led a counterattack back out into the ground his men had just abandoned. The German force, its infantry shattered, and its armor withdrawn without protection, could not hold against a renewed push, however small. What was left of the German assault broke and fell back toward Holtzwihr, abandoning the very ground it had spent the afternoon trying to take. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not show up in official reports. Hands locked into the shape of a trigger guard long after the shooting stops. Blood frozen stiff against fabric. The strange, hollow quiet that follows an hour of continuous noise. None of the documents describe what Murphy felt standing in the snow that evening, his company intact, his position held, his body already beginning to register a wound he had ignored for an hour under fire. What the documents do describe is what came next. On January 27th, reinforced American units retook Holtzwihr itself. By January 28th, German forces had been pushed out of the surrounding area east of the Ill River almost entirely. The Bois de Riedwehr, the wedge of forest that had been the German objective that whole bloody afternoon, remained in American hands because a single company had not broken when it should have, and because its commander had bought it the minutes it needed to survive intact rather than be encircled and destroyed. The Kulmar pocket itself would not be fully cleared for another 2 weeks, but the collapse of the German attack at Holtzwihr marked the moment the outcome stopped being in doubt. Months later, Audie Murphy stood before his assembled unit to receive the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration for valor, for what the official citation described in careful, restrained language as conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. He was 19 years old when he earned it, and not much older when he received it, already the veteran of Sicily, Anzio, southern France, and the Vosges, already carrying wounds that would follow him for the rest of his life. By the war's end, he held roughly 30 separate decorations for valor, including 2 Silver Stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Purple Hearts, and the French Croix de Guerre, awarded by the very nation whose frozen soil he had refused to give up that January afternoon. He left the war as the most decorated American combat soldier of the entire conflict, a rank he still holds today. The years that followed brought a different kind of battlefield. Murphy struggled for the rest of his life with insomnia and the recurring weight of what soldiers of that era called battle fatigue, sleeping some nights with a loaded pistol under his pillow, unable to fully leave the war behind, even as Hollywood turned his story into a movie and his face into a household image. Rather than hide it, he spoke about it publicly, pushing for the Veterans Administration to take the psychological cost of combat as seriously as its physical wounds, decades before that conversation became common. The man who would not leave a burning tank destroyer outside Holtzwihr spent much of the rest of his life refusing to let other veterans' invisible wounds be dismissed either. A German veteran of the fighting in Alsace, interviewed decades after the war for an oral history project, offered a final reflection that speaks for the entire hour outside Holtzwihr better than any citation could. "We were not defeated by a company that day," he said. "We were defeated by one man who would not move." It is worth sitting with what that admission actually costs a defeated soldier to say. Armies do not easily admit they were stopped by a single rifleman. And yet here, decades later, one of them did exactly that. Because the alternative explanation, that an entire assault force with tank support simply failed against dug-in American positions of ordinary size, did not match what he had personally witnessed from the other side of the smoke. The story of France's liberation is usually told as a sequence of dates on a map. Paris, August 1944. The Rhine crossings, early 1945. Germany's surrender, May. Between those dates sit thousands of afternoons like the one outside Holtzwihr, unrecorded by any headline, decided not by grand strategy but by individual men choosing, in the space of a few frozen seconds, whether to run or to stay. Most of those choices left no citation behind. Most of the men who made them are simply gone now, their names attached to nothing more than a unit roster and a grave marker somewhere in eastern France. Audie Murphy's stand survives in the record because it happened to be witnessed, documented, and eventually decorated. But it was never really about one exceptional man standing apart from everyone else fighting that winter. It was about what an entire generation of soldiers, French resistance fighters, and American infantrymen and colonial troops from across the French Empire alike were quietly willing to do to finish a war that had already cost them almost everything. Holtzwihr was a farming village most of the men who fought there had never heard of before that January and would never see again after it. They fought for it anyway, yard by yard, in snow that froze the blood in their wounds, because the alternative was letting it stay occupied one winter longer than it had to. The German soldier who watched a burning wreck keep firing long after it should have gone silent never learned the name of the man behind that machine gun until much later, if he ever learned it at all. From where he lay in the frozen mud outside Holtzwihr, all he could see was a single silhouette in the smoke, impossibly still standing, impossibly still firing, refusing every reasonable argument the battlefield offered him to stop. He assumed, like anyone would have, that whoever it was could not still be alive up there. He was wrong, and for 6 tanks and 250 men, being wrong about that one thing was enough to lose the ground entirely.